Should you read this year's Booker long list? Are these really the best novels of the last 12 months? I'm going to review every book on this year's long list, leave you with some thoughts on the long list, my wishes and my predictions for the short list, which will be announced on the 17th of September. I'm going to go through these books one at a time on the order they are listed on the Booker website, which means we're going to start with Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. One of my biggest bugbears about the Booker, or just book prizes in general, is the question of sequels. Wandering Stars is both a sequel and a prequel to Orange's debut novel, There There. There There won the Andrew Carnegie Medal, the Penn Hemingway Award, and it was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. So it's a pretty widely read novel, and I think it might be pretty hard for the judges to put aside their knowledge of the first book in judging the qualities of the second novel as a standalone work, instead of as an extension of the first novel. Wandering Stars does work as a standalone novel, but if you're interested in reading it, you should definitely read There There first, because as a standalone, this is a novel that feels like it has a big hole in the middle of it. It works as a standalone, but it is so much better as a sequel. Two timelines: 1864 Colorado, in which we follow Star, a survivor of the Sand Creek Massacre, and 2018 Oaklands, in which we follow Opal Viola Victoria Bear Shields and her nephew Orville after Orville survives a school shooting. The comparison is there to be made. Two horrible events 150 years apart. We can ask, for all that has changed in the world in those years, has anything important really changed? As modern readers, it is easy for us to empathise with the modern character Orville. It's easier for us to understand him and to transplant his feelings and emotions upon Star. And while they are quite different, a massacre is still a massacre, no matter what the motives are behind it, no matter what the weaponries are used in the massacre. I'm not saying that Star or Orville are the same characters in any way, nor that their responses are the same, but an understanding of one's emotion does provide insight into the others. And why do we have these two timelines if not to look for the similarities between them? And I very much enjoyed this tactic that Orange used. Examples are an excellent teaching aid, and with them Orange is able to explore trauma and identity. These are the key themes. Sprouting off from there is intergenerational trauma, racism and substance abuse. My favourite theme is the pressure to assimilate, and when it comes to race, there is this assumption of whiteness. There is a normality of whiteness that society enforces upon us, which we see demonstrated throughout this novel. While I think overall this is a good book, it does have some flaws. Orange uses slightly too many narrators, and in addition to the multiple timelines, it means that the novel itself doesn't really go into enough depth in any of the one points of view. It's a little surface, both thematically and much more evidently in his character development. To clarify, I don't think either of these are poorly done, but they're not A+ material either. Plot is not something that this year's Booker judges placed a high importance on at all. In fact, I think that they're a bit anti-plot. And I think that this is the element of the novel that has been done the poorest by Orange. Overall, this is a good book, but there are better books out there. The shortlist chances, I think that this is either going to be the last book to make the shortlist or the first book to miss out. It's a real middle-of-the-pack novel. If you liked Wandering Stars, I recommend reading Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi, The Night Watch by Louise Erdrich, and The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. If you put all three of these books in a blender, you might come out with something similar to Orange's novel, but you'll probably just damage your blender. Wild Houses by Colin Barrett. Small-time County Mayo drug dealer Killian English has given up the job and is settling down with his girl Sarah. Meanwhile, Nikki, the 17-year-old girlfriend of Killian's younger brother Dole, meets a strange man who lets him know that Dole is missing, and Killian has to pay what he owes. I am really confused by this novel's inclusion on the long list. If you had have told me all the other books on the long list and asked me to guess this one, I don't think I would have ever guessed it. This is a long list with very little in the way of plot, and this is a novel with very little in the way of anything other than plot. It's a fun crime thriller, but it is empty calories, meaningless fluff. While the plot is exciting, it was actually quite a boring novel, I thought. Not because nothing happens, but because it's without substance. I think this is a book the book has done a real disservice to. Look, you don't expect to see Lee Child or James Patterson make the long list. And I was expecting something more along the lines of Close to Home by Michael McGee, which looks at how violence and poverty impact upon the lives of young men and the communities in which they live. And maybe that was Barrett's intention, but if so, he is let down by his prose and character work. By the way, if you liked Wild Houses, I do actually recommend the McGee novel. Let's not mix words. This is quality pulp fiction. It is really good at what it is trying to do, but that isn't something that I personally care to read. I found it one of the most forgettable novels I've read this year. Not on the long list, but this year in general. It's a novel that does not stimulate conversation. I know that this review has been a little bit lacking, but as we say in Australia, you can't polish a turd, which kind of vaguely translates to garbage in, garbage out, and this book is trash. Chances of it making the shortlist, slim, but this does feel like one of the judges is being appeased because they have vastly different tastes in literature to the remaining judges, and maybe that is enough to get it into the final 6. Held by Anne Michaels is mind-numbingly boring. I tried and DNF'd this novel before the Booker Prize longlist was announced, and when it was announced, I gave it another try, and this time I completed it, and I regret that decision. However, this is a novel that will divide readers, and while I am firmly in the I hated it camp, if you are a reader who enjoys poetic prose, then maybe you should pick this one up. Normally in my reviews I would tell you what the book is about here, but that information is completely irrelevant for your enjoyment of this book. The topic Anne Michaels is writing about and the characters she has created are completely irrelevant to your enjoyment. This is a novel whose quality is in the prose, and you're a reader who is either going to be satisfied by that or not. A collection of interconnected short stories dealing with love, intimacy, last moments, and grief, which centres on John, who was horribly injured on a battlefield. Michael's characters are really poorly constructed. As good as her prose is, her character work is bad. Some are just names on a page, nothing more, no depth. Similarly, the setting is quite forgettable. I think the battlefield in question that John was injured in is World War I, but it doesn't really leave an impression. It could equally have been the American Civil War. It's just a pointless detail. I only know large pieces of this novel is set in Yorkshire because it says so on the blurb. The structure of this novel doesn't work. This is a 240-page book, and you can't squeeze 4 generations into 240 pages and have it work. The novel is lacking in detail and as a result is disconnected. Most criminally of all, this is a novel that doesn't inspire. This is one of the most lacking and the worst books to ever be longlisted for the Booker Prize since I have been reading. But just to tease you on future books in this review, it's not the worst of this year's batch. If you like this book, I recommend The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje. It's also completely pointless but has nice writing. Or you could try Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell because it's beautifully written but also has plot, characters, setting, themes and all the other aspects of a novel that can be enjoyed. Chances of this making the shortlist, well, given that it made the long list, it's pretty much a dead cert for the shortlist because who the hell would put this on the long list? Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner. A bizarre and often very funny novel about Sadie Smith, not her real name, a spy with equally fake boobs. who infiltrates a group of radical hippies. This, thankfully, is nothing like an Ian Fleming novel. Instead, we get long periods of reflective internal thoughts, interesting insights into Neanderthals, the cargo, and Polynesian sailors, groups and populations that are so often othered, stigmatized, excluded. This is a book examining the alternative ways of life and how the knowledge these people obtain is often discredited. It is a book about power and control. Sadie is a very likeable character, not so much in the book. The other characters don't really get along with her, but to us readers. Yet she's clearly the bad guy of the novel. We're not meant to be supporting her. Sadie is cold and selfish, and when she discovers that there isn't really a threat of violence that she needs to neutralize, she manipulates the situation to create a threat of violence and then begins to neutralize it, just so she gets paid. Doesn't that sound like a caricature of capitalism if you ever heard it? I just can't help but to think of the bureaucratic organizations creating their own work in order to justify the pay and then negotiating their own pay rises. Sadie's likability to the reader is a representation of the charm of the status quo. There is lots in this book that may make you wish to put it down and jump on Wikipedia or do some research of your own. And for me, the thing that I looked up were the cargoes. They were likely the children of Jews or Muslims who converted to Christianity. However, due to their very interesting history, their origins have been destroyed. We don't know who they actually were. But we do know that they were not visibly different to the local French population. They were completely mistreated by everybody. So think Jews in pre-World War Nazi Germany or black people in the South during segregation. The choice of the obscure cargoes and not the two better-known examples I just listed, both represents the region in France that Kushner has set the novel, and it shows us that this is happening again and again. It's easy to say the Jews and the Holocaust, and we think of a tragedy the likes that we have never seen again and hopefully never will, but the reality is we see lots of terrible acts of racism every day. The reality is, while the Holocaust was horrible, it's not a one-off event. There is also the fact that the cargoes stood up to their oppressors. So much of this novel is about resistance, but once resisted, the cargoes used their power to destroy their records, allowing them to assimilate into the population, allowing them to effectively erase themselves. Been persecuted and othered their entire lives, the cargoes wanted nothing more than to fit into the society that was persecuting them. And this is a very human thing, and it is something that Kushner is exploring. Kushner's level of research on this novel is amazing. One of my interests other than reading is human evolution, and Kushner really nailed it. Nothing is outdated. Nothing is from 20 years ago. She is debating the current theories, and she is bringing it all back to her themes and all her ideas. This is not just a weird quirk of the novel, it is actually really important to the themes. It's a little bit brilliant. There is so much in this novel that you can explore. I think the Maos are fascinating. I mean, why call a character Mao? Especially in a very political novel. Now, I'm not going to explore that. Instead, I'm just sort of keeping it short and pointing it out. But there's a lot of little nuggets in this book like that. Sadie, Lucien and Bruno were very interesting characters who were all well drawn, especially Sadie. The remaining characters, not so much. Minimal effort was made with the plot, and I think Kushner would have struggled to include a good plot without it getting in the way of her themes and discussion. The book, however, goes on for a little too long, and as I've already said, Kushner's research is fantastic, but maybe she needed to be a little bit more selective about what she included. I appreciate how hard that is because everything relates, everything is relevant, but she does repeat a lot of her ideas with new examples. That said, I do prefer an author to say a little too much than not quite enough. I really enjoyed this book. It is not perfect, but the good really outweighs the bad, and it's quite a unique book too. I really struggle to recommend something for readers who liked this because it is so unique, but I've settled on Ruth Ozeki for her ability to blend themes and unexpected ideas together and to be quite philosophical at the same time. Shortlist chances, I really do struggle with this one and predicting how it is going to be received, but I'm going to call this a potential winner. I think that this is a really good book that may not be appreciated by a lot of people. This Strange Eventful History by Claire Messud. Interconnected short stories jumping slowly forward in time from the 1940s to 2010, using the same set of characters, slowly adding to them as characters marry or have children or whatnot. And you might say that stories who use the same characters, that isn't interconnected short stories, it's just a family saga that is broken up. But Messud does hyper-focus on single events for each story, regardless of what you want to technically call it. The experience of reading it is going to be quite like interconnected short stories. The crime of this novel, however, is that none of these stories end. It reads like Messud got writer's block, said to herself, I'll shelve this part for now and work on the next part, and then forgot to come back to them. It's like the editor asked her to cut 20 pages out of each story and she took them directly from the end. Some of the resolution of these stories do get hinted at and kind of resolved in future timelines, but I was really expecting to go back to the earlier timelines at some point, and that doesn't happen. We're constantly moving forward in time. And as a reader, I was really expecting something interesting or character defining to happen at some point in this novel, but that didn't. For this novel to have a chance of working, the character construction needed to be so much stronger than it was to pull this off. It was really abysmal character work. This is a novel that jumps from World War II to Algeria's battle for independence, from France to Sydney, Argentina, Canada, and the US, and it is so timid and so scared to take a chance. There is nothing strange, much less eventful, that happens in this novel. This novel should be called This Slow and Painfully Boring History. How anybody can think that was a good title for this novel blows my mind. I guess Messud is trying to explore the connection between families while exploring her own past, but this is a vanity project, and I'm sure Messud got a lot of joy out of writing it, and I'm sure her extended family gets a lot of joy out of reading it too, but it's not a Booker-worthy novel. 448 pages, and there's no meat to chew on, no themes worth discussing, no events. Just at all. No interesting characters, no breathtaking prose, no captive scenery. Withheld, at least I can say it was trying something and I didn't like it. This novel has no ambition and it's truly terrible. But it's not the worst novel on the long list. Chances of it making the shortlist? I really hope not. And honestly, I do think that this has to be an outsider. I know I've been very negative on the book so far, and I still have some stinkers to discuss, but the remaining books are, for the most part, superior in every way to this novel. Not that that's saying a lot. So I want to say it's really unlikely to be shortlisted, but the quote inside the cover of this one from one of the Booker judges, who I can only assume read a different book to me, that I think makes it possible that this could be shortlisted. If you liked this book, I don't understand what you could have got out of it. So sorry, I don't have any recommendations for you, except maybe you could try Sensory Deprivation. Unnamed Book 13. There was a book on the long list that I was unable to purchase, and the publisher refused to grant me an ARC. Because I'm petty and that annoyed me, I won't be mentioning said book on this channel or promoting it in any way. Instead, I'd like to thank my wonderful Patreons for their support and remind you that you can support this channel too and get your name up on the screen here. So please consider signing up and reading some books with us, because there is an excellent book club attached to that Patreon. Enlightenment by Sarah Perry. I made a conscious effort not to DNF any of the titles on this year's long list. I finished Held. I finished this strange, eventful history, but I couldn't force myself to finish Enlightenment, and I had to DNF it approximately 2/3 of the way in. This is the worst novel on this year's Booker longlist. At the time of filming, I have read 158 books and DNF'd 37 this year, and this is the worst. There are a lot of plotless books on this year's Booker Prize, this being one of them, but the point of a plotless book is to take away the distraction of the plot, to allow the reader to focus on other elements of the novel. So to see a plotless book that is also completely themeless is something very unique. Comments are not a theme unless you say something about them. Perry manages to conjure up this Victorian setting for her novel. The only problem is she has based it around the turn of the century. Maybe she has done that through the feel of her prose, which is completely overridden and to no beauty whatsoever. As somebody who is terrible at punctuation and writes run-on sentence after run-on sentence himself, it's nice to see that there is somebody even worse at punctuation than me out there who is also a successful author. And while the Victorians did overwrite their prose compared to today's author, most of them did manage to maintain a focus and clarity that Perry's prose lacks. Perry's terrible writing makes this book difficult to follow. Not as difficult as the complete absence of event, plot, or interesting characters do, but bad books are usually poor for multiple reasons. I've been slightly unfair to Enlightenment in this review. This is a novel about faith, science, and love, and the comet is a tool to discuss why we believe things, but it's just so boring. I mean, it's been done before. This is the sort of discussion that any science, art, philosophy, or religion student has had a million times before. I mean, what's next, Booker Prize? Let's have a book discussing the radical idea of what is or is not art. That's not been done before. Or how about we discuss what's good and what's evil? We might as well have a book discussing why the sky is blue. I mean, come on. The Da Vinci Code had better plot, prose, and characters than this one. What are the chances of this making the shortlist? I don't see how that could possibly happen. But then again, it shouldn't be longlisted either. So my assessment of this book is clearly not relevant. If you like this book, well, it really doesn't matter what book I recommend. Apparently, you're just entertained by the act of reading. Just read the first thing you see. Book or no, it's bound to be just as good. Orbital by Samantha Harvey. Some places have labelled this novel as science fiction just because it is set in space. It's not. And if you're in the mood for sci-fi, this book is not going to scratch that itch. This is a very simple, very gentle and beautiful novel that is also completely boring. A group of astronauts in a spaceship orbiting the planet, looking out of their window at the beauty of the planet below them. I'm not mixing my words. The prose is outstanding. The concept is sleep-inducing. If you've read this and you gave it 5 stars, you're completely correct. If you read it and you gave it 1 star, you're also completely correct. And so too is everybody between. It's not a reflection on the quality of the book. It's a reflection on what you like in a novel. What you rate this is about you as a reader, and it's not a judgment of you as a reader. This is a meditation. It's not a novel. This is comfortably the book with the best prose on the long list, and Harvey has a rare talent for writing a setting, and the setting is not the space station, but rather the world the inhabitants of said space station are observing. Harvey is writing about connectivity, giving us a sense of how small our world is, all as we fly quickly from one country to the next. Russia, Japan, Britain, the USA and Italy are all represented aboard this spaceship, and Harvey includes a slightly humorous tale of the toilets on the station, with each nationality having their own toilets and seeking to charge the other countries if their toilets are used. The crew, however, pay no attention to the dispute, going wherever they please. Even though it's about some of the least pleasant functions of the human body, I think that this is a lovely metaphor for what divides us and brings us together. Countries fight about things that don't actually matter, and away from the influence of those in power, the people impacted by these wars don't actually care about the outcome one bit. They are happy to work together and be friends. If you enjoyed Orbital, I think you're looking for gentle observational novels with very nice prose, so I cannot help but to think of Kazuo Ishigiro's Booker Prize winning novel The Remains of the Day, or maybe even Stoner by John Williams. Chances of this making the shortlist? I can see the similarities between this novel and Held, except that Orbital is just of so much higher quality. And I think that means it's almost certainly going to make the shortlist at the expense of Held. While it is certainly not my favourite book from the long list, I can even see this book winning, and I think it's pretty likely to be longlisted. James by Percival Everett. Regardless of how far this novel goes on the Booker Prize, I think it's probably fair to say that James by Percival Everett is the book of 2024. It's certainly the book with the most buzz, the most attention, and just the most hype. It's captured so many people's imagination, and I hear so few negative reviews, and so many people from different camps love this book. And people such as myself who didn't previously get along with Percival Everett's work have completely changed their mind of him because of this novel. A retelling of Huckleberry Finn from the point of view of Jim, Everett is aiming to give us a black perspective on a white tale. By changing the perspective, Everett has given himself some gaps to fill in, some things that only Jim, or James as he is now called, could see, and this allows him to point out what Twain couldn't see. Not because he was unable to, but because of his very position in life he couldn't, because he was white, he couldn't see it. Like all of Everett's novels, this is a satire. And the likelihood of a lot of these events taking place in the real world is relatively low. Yet, I guess they're all possible. James runs an English class for all the slaves to learn correct, incorrect English, so that the white people think the slaves are not as intelligent as them. And how would Twain know about a secret English class? This is not the only function of this class. It is to demonstrate the expectation of black stupidity. It is to demonstrate the nature of society and point out that the language or dialects that black people use isn't a sign of low intelligence. Actually, it kind of makes black people bilingual. They now need to know how to speak Black English and White English. The correct incorrect English class is an early example that doesn't give too much away, and it's one that I particularly enjoyed, which is why I always mention it when I discuss James. But the entire novel is full of this sort of re-examining of what we know about black people living in the USA in the time that Mark Twain was writing his novels, because most of what we have written down comes from a white perspective. And how much can a white person ever know about black people, especially if black people intentionally act differently around them? This is not another book telling us how horrible racism is and how miserable slavery is. Hopefully we can all agree that those things are horrible and miserable. It is not telling white people to act better or black people to change their actions in any way. It is just saying black people act differently around white people, and that creates an interesting perspective and an interesting bias in our history, and one that we may not be completely aware of. And to be completely honest, I was not aware of it. This is a book that is simultaneously calling out Mark Twain, but then at the same time it's saying you've got to give him a break because it was impossible for him to get it right. And if you read this with Twain's novel, it becomes a really interesting example of how perspectives can completely change a story without altering the events. Everett is very playful, he's very silly in his writing style, and so was Twain. And there is an argument that if Twain was born 100-ish years later and black, he would be called Percival Everett. Calling one author a modern day version of another is always a bit silly, but Everett's style is very much suited to channeling Twain's writing. I feel like Everett was born to write this book. It is a concept so well suited to his talents. I have not read Paul Beatty's The Sellout, but I hear he is compared to Percival Everett a lot, which is probably because of his ability to write satirical novels about race, and that is where I'll be reading next. I even think something like My Sister the Serial Killer might be popular with fans of James, but the trouble is, every book I think of as a comparison is lacking in one area or in the execution as a whole. Will this book be shortlisted? I have to think this book is the favourite to win the prize outright, and I will be shocked if it's not shortlisted. It does have some good books to get past if it's going to win the entire prize, though, and one of those books is The Safekeep by Yael van der Wouden. Set 15 years after World War II has finished in a rural Dutch town, Isabel lives in her parents' house, although technically it will be her brother's Louis through inheritance soon. Isabel loves everything about the house. The hairs on every tea cloth, the plates, the cutlery. It's her home and she loves it. Louis prefers to live in the city, but introduces Isabel to Eva, his fiancée, and while he is out of town on business, Eva asks to stay with Isabel, much to the terror and hostility of Isabel. Eva is undeterred by Isabel. She is charming and not afraid to be confrontational when required, and the tension between the two gradually twists into something else. Suspecting Eva might be stealing household objects from her, Isabel becomes suspicious as spoons go missing and then a plate. This, for me, is a novel that starts out like it was written by Sarah Waters and finishes like Claire Fuller took over for her. It really is a novel in two halves, and I have seen some people say that they like the first half or the second half better. So with that in mind, I do recommend those two authors if you like this book, but with the caveat of which half of the book did you like better. It is a novel questioning ownership and possession and looking at them through the lens of inheritance, hatred and law. It is looking at theft and policing. If Eva is stealing from Isabel, how does that change their relationship? How does the betrayal impact upon the trust? And don't forget that there is uncertainty, and how does that influence the trust? There is quite a lot in this novel. However, it is the sort of novel where a detailed review of it could easily spoil the book. Plot-wise, it is the best novel on the long list. Actually, plot-wise, this is potentially the only good novel on the long list. But it is one of these novels where the plot doesn't work without the characters, and the characters don't work without the themes, and the themes don't work without the plot. All three are codependent, and all three are done wonderfully. Maybe the excellent plot is a little bit of a double-edged sword too, because yes, it does make the reading of this novel more enjoyable, but maybe because of how it is constructed, it leads readers to a surface understanding of the themes. They may or may not look for the extra details that can be squeezed out, and it is the juice of this book that makes it delicious. If you think that this is a book about Nazis, then please go back and examine it again. I think it says a lot more about some of the current issues that is affecting us today than it does about historical issues. Will this make the shortlist? I really hope so. It is exquisite and brilliant and has all the qualities of a winning novel. It is a little bit of an outlier on the long list, so maybe it won't be to all of the judges' tastes. And to be honest, I'm questioning the judges' judgment with this long list. But if everything is right in this world, this book will make the shortlist. My Friends by Hisham Matar. If Matar wins the Booker Prize, he will become only the second author after George Saunders to win both the Pulitzer Prize and the Booker Prize. This is a novel about a young Libyan man, Khalid, who moves to the UK to study and gets involved in politics and attends an anti-Gaddafi protest in London. With his family still living in Libya, he soon realises that his political activity risks their lives. This book has won the Orwell Prize for political fiction, and it does capture a complex range of influences upon Khalid. Not just the pressure to conform with Libyan policies, but the influence that their government had on Libyans outside of Libya, the terrifying encounters he has in the UK, and the complex and counteracting desires to both return home and to continue to build a life in a new country. Khaled's two friends take different paths to Khaled, and we can see the different paths exiled Libyans had under Gaddafi. Under all this politics is Khaled's life. And in the UK, he does make new friends, he does make new connections, and they almost take on a new family role in his new life. And there is an ongoing question about what is family and what does that concept mean to immigrants, especially those that have left their old family behind. This, however, disappointed me. I see the attraction of this novel, but it was very repetitive. The arguments and examples were all quite similar, and while they're very good and valid arguments, the extra examples didn't really add to the complexity of the novel. And maybe the words Matar spent repeating himself could have been better used building the characters, building the tensions, the setting, or the emotions. I didn't really care for Khaled like I normally do for a protagonist. Normally it's very hard not to like a protagonist, but I felt kept at arm's reach from him. You know when somebody tells you a joke and you don't initially get it and you think about it for a moment and you realise what the joke is, but that's never funny? I kind of felt like with Khaled, I had to stop and I had to think about his journey and his emotions, and I got it in the end, but it wasn't intuitive, and that really dulled the experience for me. The good reviews for this are a little overwhelming. For me, however, this is an important novel, but the quality was just alright. It was acceptable. I didn't hate it, but I can acknowledge that that is my experience with it, and that this novel does have its fans, and I do completely understand where they're coming from too. This will almost certainly make the shortlist, and it is a book I can see winning the entire prize. If you compare this novel to the last few winners, you can really see some similarities. While stylistically, Prophet's Song and The Seven Moons of Mali Amida are completely different, they all contain that strong and very relevant political criticism. I would compare this novel to other novels such as The Road to the Country by Chikozi Obioma or Home Fire by Camilla Shamsi. And if you like this one, it would be one of those two I would read next. Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood. This is a novel exploring forgiveness. A woman leaves her marriage and city life and moves into a monastery back into the rural city where she grew up. She is not religious, she is not converting, and this isn't a novel overly about faith. But at the heart of Christianity is the message, turn the other cheek. And I know certain Christians may follow that better than others, but certainly some Christians follow a practice of tolerance and forgiveness, and that is why I believe this book is set in a monastery. While in the monastery, COVID happens and our protagonist's temporary visit becomes permanent. Now don't worry, this is not a lockdown novel, but our protagonist is stuck, and so too is a nun who aims to bring back the bones of a likely murdered nun from Thailand and have her buried in the monastery. The sister in question went to school with our protagonist and was bullied by basically everybody at the school, including our protagonist. One of the nuns at the monastery grieves her friend and waits for her bones to be returned. Finally, a biblical-style plague of mice hit the town. Not everything is quite what it seems initially, and Wood delves into the characters and relationships, exploring different types of forgiveness and different ways to respond to it, different meanings, and questioning who benefits from forgiveness. When we seek forgiveness, is it not a mark of kindness from the person we've wronged to grant it, or is it comforting to them to have received an apology or admission of guilt in the first place? Our protagonist apologizes to the nun she bullied at high school, only for the nun not to remember the bullying, and as such she doesn't forgive her. How can you forgive something you don't remember? And this comes across as cruel, as mean. Did she really not remember? The nun in question, however, is a minor celebrity working with various humanitarian agencies and has been in some rather horrible and tense situations. Maybe a few kids saying mean things to her in high school doesn't really compare. It doesn't seem unreasonable that she doesn't remember. Or maybe the bullying has helped her grow thick skin and allowed her to grow into the human she is now. Maybe she is, in a weird way, grateful for the bullying as it shaped her life, and as such, does she really want to forgive her character-defining incidents? Why are we obligated to forgive if somebody is asking for it? This is another very low plot novel, a very reflective novel, and it really is just exploring one or maybe two topics very deeply. It does really discuss simplifying your life or giving up things too. I can definitely see readers coming out of this novel thinking it's deep, profound and beautiful, but I can also see readers reading it and thinking, is that all? This, like the majority of books on this long list, is not a book immune to the criticism of being boring. I, however, have a different criticism of this book. And if you're watching this and have a theory about this, please let me know in the comments section. But I don't understand what the plague of mice has to do with anything. Now, part of this might be me. Not only am I just one reader who understands what he understands, and sometimes that's everything and sometimes that's nothing, but I am also equal parts terrified and disgusted of mice. Not to mention I just really hate them and their rat cousins. I'm not really reading those sections with my calm, rational logic hat on, but they do seem completely unnecessary to me, and maybe I've missed something that makes this book a little more brilliant. What are its chances of making the shortlist? Overall, I would say that this is a good book without being a particularly great book. I would put this one on the cusp of making it. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Quite similar to the Tommy Orange one. It's a bit 50-50 for me. If you like this book, well, I really want to compare it to Elizabeth Strout and Rachel Cusk, but I think that's demonstratively unfair on Charlotte Wood, who has written a much better novel than anything I have ever read from either of those two authors. My reading does have a big Marilyn Robinson-shaped hole in it, but it does really sound like her novels, especially her Gilead series. Headshot by Rita Bullwinkle. 8 adolescent women are punching it out for a junior boxing title. We follow each of the 7 fights. While we do follow the fights and find out who wins and so on, what we're really doing is finding out about the women, their past, their future, what boxing means to them. This really is just a character portrait, or rather it is 8 character portraits. The plot is incredibly simple. You kind of try to figure out who is going to win each fight and who's going to win the entire tournament. And personally, I think I was wrong well more than 50% of the time on that one. But this is a book kind of with the same hook as a murder mystery. You want to know who done it and you want to know who wins. There are themes of coming of age, of bodily autonomy, the link between body and person or personality, intimidation, dedication, expectation, violence, intimacy, women in sport, breaking gender norms, and the various different lives of women. There is quite a lot of things that can be picked out of this novel, but there's not a lot done to a great deal of detail. And if you are a plot or a themed driven reader, this is probably not your book. This is really a book for character readers. Our 8 girls are vividly drawn. Minor details such as the weird hat one of them wears really do pull us towards their identity. For some characters, boxing is not really that important. This could be a tennis or a Connect 4 tournament. For others, boxing is the key to their personality. And I really liked that. As a comparison, I think everybody probably likes delicious food, but that alone doesn't make you a foodie. It really does point out that what you do and what your identity is are not the same thing. And I think this is where Bullwinkle excels in her character drawing. She communicates the identity of these women as well as their routines, their future and their past. And none of these women are stereotypes. None of them are the same. This is an example of a very simple book that does what it wants to do and does it very well, but doesn't pay a lot of attention to anything else. A novel that needs to find the right reader to be enjoyed. Chances of this one making the long list? Possible. I mean, I guess they're all possible. They all got longlisted after all. It's certainly not bottom of my list. However, I'm not sure if it will or won't progress. The prose style is very simple and serviceable, which I don't mind in the least. Doesn't really fit in with a lot of the other books. And that makes me think that this was one of the last books to be longlisted, so maybe it's going to miss out. I can see some similarities between this and Fight Night by Miriam Taves. I do think Fight Night is a little bit of a better novel, although nobody should be upset with a bad comparison to Miriam Taves. So what are my thoughts on this long list? Overall, this is a pretty poor long list. While there are some very good books, overall, the individual books are not of the quality I expect. And as a collection of books, this just doesn't work. The judges here have favoured simple books with a clear focus that are often plotless. But there's contradictions to this. I don't understand where Wild Houses fits in this long list at all. And there's quite a few reflective novels here. But we have Orbital, which is beautifully written, Creation Lake, which is cynical but hilarious, and Headshot, which is simple but communicative. Stylistically, while they have similarities, they don't really go together. It's not like this is a long list with something for everybody either. I don't know how they managed to create a long list so narrow in scope, yet so much without identity. I think my biggest criticism is that there are just too many books that are mediocre or worse. Some of them are actually stunningly poor. I think I could create a long list randomly by pulling names out of a hat, and it would be better than this long list. In fact, I'm going to do that. That is an upcoming video, so make sure you're subscribed, and while you're at it, like this video. I know I have different tastes to the judges, but that happens every year. Previously, I've looked at certain books and I said, that's a terrible novel, but I do understand why some people like this book. This year, what on earth is this strange eventful history or Enlightenment doing on the long list? What on earth is the attraction of those books? This is a long list lacking in quality, lacking in depth and diversity. Diversity both in terms of the identity of the author and in terms of the style of book written. It has not taken a risk with a single title on the long list either. I was aware of all of these titles before the long list was announced, and I think a lot of book nerds will be in the same camp. And as you're going to see in a moment, my wish list for the shortlist contains the 5 books I had already read, not including the one book I DNF'd prior to the long list. Reading the long list has not added anything positive to my reading year, which is extra disappointing, especially in comparison to last year, where 2 of my top 4 books of the year were from the Booker Prize and I did not read them prior. So this is my wish list for the shortlist. In my opinion, the Safekeep and James are easily the best 2 novels on the long list. Creation Lake is a clear third. The next 3, however, that feels like scraping the bottom of the barrel. I'm going to go with Wandering Stars, Stoneyard Devotional and Headshot, but I could easily allow Orbital or My Friends on the shortlist if somebody wanted to argue with them. I just don't have a lot of enthusiasm for any of those 5 books, really. More than that, I just don't want to see Held, This Strange Eventful History, or Enlightenment being shortlisted. I actively disliked those novels. What do I think will actually happen? I think My Friends and James must be the favourite for the prize. I'm pretty confident Orbital will make the shortlist too. From then on in, I think it's a little hard. I'd probably guess the Safekeep, Stoneyard Devotional and Creation Lake, but I'm also kind of assuming the judges will pick the best books, and they clearly haven't done that to date. So, should you read this year's long list? No, be kind to yourself and skip it. Maybe you could pick the 1 to 4 books that appeal to you and leave it there, but don't do the whole thing. And are these the best books of the year? No, they're not.